Assalamu alaikum. We're back. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much for this incredible surah. I think people are going to need some serious time to process it, but it's just, I mean, the social impact, just the idea that every single person matters it's so beautiful. Alhamdulillah, and I'm just always so grateful that I just feel like I've never heard anything like this, and and just beyond grateful that we are learning here now together and receiving this beautiful knowledge. So thank you so much. Okay, Jana, would you like to start?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much. I have two questions. The first is there a connection between the 9 signs of the story of Sayyidina Musa and the 9 individuals in Thamud?
No.
So that's the first one. And then the second question that I have is that, and I really don't want to presume to have like a insight that, you know, if it's nothing, it's nothing. But for Ayah 82, and you said that, you know, a dabba doesn't have to necessarily be a calamity or a beast. It just has to be something that treads on the earth, and that it's going to come out of the earth. And then earlier, we hear the story of Sulaiman, where the ants make a noise and they like speak something, and only Sulaiman can hear them, and then they go into the earth. And so we have an understanding of them as something, before knowing the rest of the surah, that it was an insignificant, like they're insignificant individually, and they went into the earth for safety and to rebuild and to go into the earth. Is it possible that the connection between that portion of the surah and then Ayah 82, the thing that comes out of the earth and it causes a ruckus or it causes a big change or something larger, does that have a connection between the Naml that went into the earth and then all of a sudden we can actually hear them when they're coming out, where the insignificant now becomes significant? So those are my two questions.
Can you paraphrase? Sorry.
So the first question, whether the 9 signs of Moses alayhi salam could be related to the 9 rahat of Saleh. I actually never thought of that. So I don't know. I've always taken it literally as 9 signs, 9 afflictions that befell the Egyptians, and 9 powerful people who corrupted. But I mean, it is an interesting parallel, 9 and 9. The second question about the ants who they go into the earth for safety, and then the dabba that is mentioned later on, could it emerge from the earth? I mean, what's really interesting is that so many of the reports that are transmitted about that dabba talk about some type of something that actually does emerge from the earth. I mean, in most of these reports, it's like a form of like a worm. And I've just always, because these reports are Israelite traditions, they're paraphrasing stories from the Talmud mostly. I've always discounted them, but the idea itself is very interesting. I mean, but I had never thought of it. I mean, the idea itself is very interesting. What's very there is I'm trying to remember where in the Quran, but there's a reference in the Quran um, about the in reference to the idabba in the context of idabba that could be on the earth or even in the samawat, which is rather fascinating because dabba is literally something that treads, and typically it's on the earth, but it could also be anything that exists. What so yeah, I mean, I don't know. It would be a fascinating idea to explore. But I'm not sure. I mean, knowing the traditions that are out there and that they're all very mythological and they're all very fantastical and they all come from the Israelite tradition, I don't know how to resolve it. Unless someone does a more comprehensive study of the Quran as to the word dabba and all the time that the word dabba is mentioned in the Quran and all the possible meanings, that might yield some interesting yield some interesting results. I'm looking at the word dabba, so mostly dabba is mentioned in the context of the earth. ما من دابة في الأرض. So Allah created every dabba from water. وَاللَّهُ خَلْقَ كُلَّ دَابَّةٍ مِّن مَاءٍ. But it says dabba أخرجنا لهم دابة من الأرض. So a dabba from the earth that's going to speak to them. I don't know. It's very fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, see, in Surah Al-Shura, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَثَّ فِيهِمَا مِنْ دَابَّةٍ. So we created the heavens and the earth, and what God created in the heavens and in the earth, min dabba. في السماوات والأرض وبث فيهما من دابة. So this would seem to indicate that dabba could also be something in the heavens, which I've always thought was very interesting in terms of that would take us to like UFOs and things like that. Because Allah, Allah could create dawab that were created that are not on earth, but elsewhere. Arguably, I think. Yeah. I don't know.
Okay, heavy duty question. Okay.
Uh-oh.
Oh, unless does anyone else have one here before we take them?
What, is it your question or interactive?
No, interactive. So actually, let's start in here first. Go for it, Cheyenne. You got a breather.
That it could be a human?
Well,
Never mind. I'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
Since Surah Al-Hijr, I've been fascinated by the conversation that Shaitan has with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in which he's lamenting his annoyance and blaming Allah for his misguidance. and says, the same way that you misguided me, I'm going to misguide your creation and make al-ard zaynan lahum, make the path, or make it look onto them, pleasing or something nice. And I can't remember if it's in the same surah or elsewhere that it says something along the lines that I will make their amal, their actions seem fair or just.
Yeah.
And again, this shows itself numerous times in Al-Naml. Once it happens a second time in verse 24. Again, زَيْنًا لَهُمُ الشَّيْطَانُ أَعْمَالُهُم. And then even before that, but the thing that struck me was earlier, and I can't find the notes exactly which verse. Earlier in the surah, here it is, verse 4. In verse 4, here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who is saying that I will make amalahum zayna. I will make it zaynan lahum amalahum. I think it raises a question about the seemingly odd relationship between shaitan and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in that does Allah continue to use shayateen in his service in some type of way, despite them even being aware that, okay, since this happened, you think that you're individual that can make its own decisions, but yet you're still under my employ, and under my employ I send either tests of misguidance towards my people, or if you are already in misguidance, then I can continue to misguide you with even your own personal deceiver on a long term. And that kind of I'm shy to even say this bit, but I was thinking about that in the terms of in verse 82, and even a few verses previous, in which it's speaking about it will not, their guidance will not avail those who are deaf and blind and dead and this sort of thing. And then the mention of the daba and this kind of thing. So I was wondering whether there may be a connection between all of these, that in fact what it is from the ard maybe is not necessarily from the ard, but rather it's from the path that was adorned to look fair unto them, that you are essentially building your own shaitan that will continue to lead you into punishment now and eternally, essentially.
Any way to paraphrase that? Or give us the essence of the question.
No, I'm not sure how to paraphrase that. I mean, 82. أخرجنا لهم دابة من الأرض. So, it's vague enough to incorporate, or possibly incorporate, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if a connection can be made to anything satanic or demonic. But it is vague enough or broad enough to incorporate anything that we don't have a frame of reference for, that comes out of the earth and that speaks to human beings. That's as much as really we can say, or that it is. Now, comes out of the earth could be man-made, so that Allah allowed it to take place, or Allah inspired human beings to make it, or it could be something directly just made by God without the mediation of human beings. The language would bear both. The earlier reference in 4, because this goes back to the whole زَيَّنَّ لَهُمْ أَعْمَالَهُمْ فَهُمْ يَعْمَهُونَ. Every time the زَيَّنَّ or زَيَّنَ is mentioned in the Quran, or nearly every time it's زَيَّنَ الشَّيْطَانُ لَهُمْ أَعْمَالَهُم. The devil does, the zayyan is to make something look good. So it's shaitan that comes and makes the acts of people look good to them. Except for one ayah where it says زَيَّنَّا لَهُمْ, or زُيِّنَ لَهُمْ سُوءَ عَمَلِهِمْ, that their evil deeds were made to look good for them. Okay, so then here, where it's not shaitan that does the tazyin of the amal, it's not the shaitan who's make a deed look good, and it's not something that has the descriptive term su' amalihim, bad deeds that were made to look good. It simply refers to zayyana lahum a'malahum, that their deeds were made to look good. Because of that, because here we don't have the intervening factor of shaitan who's beautifying the act, or there is no the qualifier su' amalihim, which would mean evil deeds. It simply says that their deeds were made to look good. So that gave rise to that debate that we talked about, whether it's talking about that God allowed them to understand what good deeds are and they chose to forgo that, or whether God is saying that their evil deeds, God allowed them to see their evil deeds as bad. But if it's referring to evil deeds, then why doesn't it say su'a amalihim, which is typically the Quranic style, that the qualifier that it's evil deeds, su'a amalihim, not just amalihim. But I think the point you're raising is sort of a larger theological point. Whether ultimately, even when shayateen act, they act under Allah's sovereignty. So in other words, that in fact, even when shayateen lead people astray, they are still acting according to the divine plan. And that's a bigger, much bigger debate, a much bigger issue, because that has to do with the whole notion of free will, and to what extent there is predetermination of acts, whether in fact God whether God simply allows evil deeds to take place, or God creates the evil deeds that take place. And that's a much larger debate and a much bigger thing. But my position is that God doesn't create evil deeds, which is not the orthodox Muslim position in the contemporary age. But it's a very big topic, because then we'd have to get into the whole issue of the relationship between God and khalq, and khalq al-ashya and khalq al-af'al, and which is, I mean, much bigger philosophical issue.
Zakat is mentioned in verse 3. I had thought that my understanding was that zakat was a requirement or legislated as the institution until Medina. Is this referring to that, or is it kind of like the more broader charitable acts that you also mentioned? And then verse 62, أَمَّنْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ. I mean, when after going through your tafsir and then reading this, it sounded like the story of from Musa to Sulaiman. Musa, you mentioned in the beginning, is the muttar. He's he's in a state of desperation. And then وَيَجْعَلُكُمْ خُلَفَاءَ, the Khalifa being Sulaiman. Is that correct? And then is this also maybe speaking to the Prophet ﷺ and his own ummah and future generations?
The answer to the first question about the zakah and the reference in the early on in the surah to the institution of zakah, this is, I think it's quite clear that the early references to the zakat in Mecca was a broad reference. It was, and in fact, I mean, in most cases when the Quran talks about zakah, it is not talking about the legal definition of zakah, but talking more about the moral definition of zakah, which includes the sadaqah and includes charitable giving well beyond the required minimum amount. Because remember that 2.5% on ما يحول عليه الحول and so on is a minimum. That's just the minimum account. It is not what would put a person in close to Allah. It is just what would prevent a person from committing sin. And a lot of Muslims, especially in the modern age, confuse this point. They think that they are actually coming close to Allah just by paying the minimum zakah. The minimum zakah, exactly that. It's just the minimum zakah, so that you haven't violated the fard min furud, because it is a fard. But it's not it's not taqarrub lillah. It's just there's a huge difference between أداء الفرد and التقرب, or being drawing closer to Allah through charitable giving. And the biggest proof of that is the sunnah of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. I mean, not a single. We don't actually have any of the narratives that are told about charitable Sahaba is limited to the legal zakah. They always go well beyond the legal zakah. And the Prophet himself, ﷺ, was the best example of that. And I don't know at what point in Islamic history Muslims just got so twisted in their thinking that they started thinking that the legal zakah is somehow all that's expected of them, which is very minimal. I mean, 2.5% over what you don't use, and you save for a year or over, is very minimal. The second question, the sort of thing about was Musa a Muttar, and it's interesting because that actually there are some theological discussions on this, because
Sorry, what's the English translation of that?
was Musa a Muttar is someone who has like confronts a situation of necessity and like is in desperate condition and praying to God for help during their desperation. And on the one hand, yes, he is a Muttar because he was desperate. But on the other hand, what Moses received was well beyond what a Muttar would receive. I mean, he went looking for some fire for his family, but what was stored for him is prophethood, and Allah speaking to him directly, which is so I don't know if Moses would fall in the category of that type of Torah, but I think what is clear from Surah Al-Naml is the larger point that, and I think that's maybe what you're getting at, is that from the desperate situation that Moses is in to an istikhlaf, or to actually inheriting the earth or becoming God's viceroys in the form that we saw with Sulaiman, it takes many micro steps, but micro steps done in the right direction, with the right ethical fortitude, and it's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Allah could be with you from the most basic level, where you are calling upon God to help you during desperate times, to actually istikhlaf al-ard, to exactly happened with Muslims, where they become a major force, a dominant force. But that requires a commitment to all these micro steps that are done with due diligence and deliberation and commitment. And I think that's the whole point of Surah Al-Naml.
Any more questions in here? Okay, now I'm gonna go to the heavy question. Okay, I know this is a heavy and difficult subject, so if you prefer not to address it at this time, that is fine. I've looked at Islam Awakened, which I think is a website, which gives a large amount of translations, looks like 30 or more, all kinds of English translations. And from the Arabic that I do know, the wording does not seem to indicate that sodomy is the issue per se, but rather the males preferring other males instead of women for sexual desire and to express their lust. Nothing of sodomizing women or children is mentioned in any of the verses, in any of the versions of Lot in the Quran. It seems to be a repeated theme of men desiring or practicing lust with men, whether aggressively or not seems to be an additional aspect. With all due respect and trying very hard here to keep in mind cultural and social bias, I'm struggling to see how and where these verses are not unequivocally against homosexuality in the people of Lot. Earlier in the halaqah, you had said that there is a danger for any individual or community to become self-reverential and fit the Quran to their own urf and ada. Is there a danger of that in this case, where we are in an era of trying to rightfully foster compassion and mercy, as Islam requires us to do towards all human beings, towards the LGBTQ community, but simultaneously trying to figure out how to do that when the Quran demonstrates a heteronormative moral and ethical standard in sexual acts within the confines of marriage? The Aggression and Rape Act seems to be very limited to hadith, similar to the second coming of Jesus. So does that take precedence in interpretation, or the Arabic, which seems to emphasize same-sex lust among the men and even Lot's wife supporting it? In the context of Al-Naml, among all 5 stories, could the example of Lot's people not simply indicate how humans that refuse to accept the God-given rules and honor of doing their part, human ants, as you said, but rather outrightly rebel in any shape or form against what God has enjoined, are destined for His wrath?
I mean, this is an issue of interpretation again. So one, it's not the issue of shahwa, because if you're talking about desire, if you're talking about what the actual language of the Quran is, إنكم لتأتون الرجال شهوة من دون النساء. So من دون النساء. So it's not إنكم لتأتون الرجال شهوة, that you desire men, but you desire men exclusively. So if you're doing literal interpretation, because the question implies, should the typical traditional type of question about, do we read the Quran literally, and do we look at history, do we look at evidence, do we look at circumstances? Is the Quran the language of the Quran its own moral code? So, let's go with that for a bit. So, one, Lut is a prophet, and if you're going to talk about studying the Quran comprehensively, then you have to understand, you have to see what the Quran says about Lut in his relationship to Ibrahim and the prophecy of Ibrahim. And the fact that Lut is inviting these people to not just abstain from shahwa dun nisa, تأتون الرجال شهوة دون النساء, to the exclusion, but that he's also inviting them to follow him as a prophet. So is Lut the prophet of heterosexuality? That's it? I don't know of any theologian who's ever said that. So that's one issue that you have with the literal approach. So, was Lut the first prophet of sexual orientation solely? I am sent by God to lead you to correct sexual orientation. I don't know of any theologian who said that. Because the language itself, the Quran, the text of the Quran doesn't lead to that. So we know that it's not just sexual orientation. So that's one. Second, تأتون الرجال شهوة من دون النساء. You have a group of, you have a nation. Now, in the sources, the Quran doesn't tell us what was the population of the people of Lot. So, you don't want to go beyond the Quran. So, then we're stuck. We don't know if they were 100 people. We don't know if they were 10,000 people. We don't know if there are 100,000 people, which wouldn't work, because even prayer and fasting and zakah wouldn't work if we don't go beyond the Quran. We need the Sunnah. Because if you follow the literalist approach that people who love to pretend that they're literalists do, you're going to end up with us not knowing how to pray, not knowing how to fast, not knowing how to pray zakah, not knowing how to do hajj, not knowing how to do anything. So we don't simply limit ourselves to the text of the Quran in any situation, except when we want to condemn homosexuals, or to get on the case of women, or to do something that we want to do. So let's be very clear. That's a very disingenuous tactic. Very disingenuous. Because we don't do it. No jurist trains just to interpret the Quran and not anything beyond the Quran. Because it wouldn't work. It would not work. Not even Shahada would work. So all these Quranic, let's do literal, they're very disingenuous. But okay, so let's go a step. So now, his archaeological evidence? Well, the archaeological evidence of Sodom would indicate that there were not less than 30,000 people. Probably much more. But according to the text of the Quran, تَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِنْ دُونِ النِّسَاءِ, what is the percentage of homosexuals in any normal population? 4%? 5%? 10%? So you have a people where all the males go after men, and they're not interested in marriage. That's why I say homosexuality was an ideology.
Not homosexuality. Sodomy.
Sodomy. What is the do we have an example? Yes, we know that in Greek culture, in historical studies, that in Greek culture and in Roman culture, there was a cultural institution where people would actually practice sodomy as a cultural practice. So, is it reasonable to, because of our study of history, to say, well, maybe the people of Lot were like the Greeks and like the Romans, but those who are disingenuously want to interpret the Quran as a self-referential book, they want us to ignore history. They'll say, no, don't look at history. Okay, so then tell me, what do we do about a people who, subhanallah, Allah create all the men sodomies? They sodomize. And they're not interested in other women. Do you know of any nation where Allah has created 100% of the men sodomites, homosexual sodomites? Because you're saying it's only interest in men, not sodomizing women, not sodomizing children, not sodomizing strangers, not sodomizing. It's just, so they're only interested in men. How would that happen? So you're telling me the Quran is describing something we've never seen in history. But if that's the case, then qiyasan, it doesn't apply to any other situation. Because we don't know of any other situation where we've seen the people of Lot, like the people of Lot. When Lot tells them, here is my daughters, and they're not interested in the daughters. So then they have a principal disinterest in women. Now, let's pretend that the people of Lot were actually like that. There were people who had no interest in women and only interested in men. Well, that's so unlike anything we've seen that, again, we can't rule by analogy to any other situation. If we're doing this disingenuous literalist interpretation of the Quran. What does it mean to say, oh, well, that comes from hadith? So now we don't like hadith? When hadith is actually giving us historical understanding of things that are referenced to in the Quran in broad lines, now we say, and do we want to apply the same principle to the Prophet? So let's take out Battle of Hunayn. Let's take out Battle of Banu Qunayqa. Let's take out everything that the Hadith told us about Uhud. Everything that the Hadith told us about Badr. And let's make Badr and Uhud just referential within the text of the Quran. What's going to be left? So my point is that people who tell me, no, it's just they themselves has an ideological project. It's either they want to suspect the Quran of the intellectual project that they have because of the weakness of their own faith. They have an issue with in Islam, or they have a problem with homosexuality that they want to project into the text of the Quran. Homosexuality itself, as an institution, it's a modern thing. Because in the Islamic tradition, it was assumed that all women can desire men and women equally. And all men can desire men and women equally. In the culture I grew up in, it was, they told you, don't show your aura in front of any man because it is normal and natural for even the most heterosexual man to see your aura and desire you. And we were raised with the idea that you shouldn't look at the aura of little children because shaitan could come to you, even as a heterosexual man, and tell you, look, this child is very desirable. It is only when I came to the United States that I learned that no, those who desire sodomy are a category, and those who don't desire sodomy are a category. That's Western culture. That's Western culture projected onto the world. But if you read history, if you study history, you discover that that's not the way the world has functioned most of humanity. People didn't go around categorizing themselves as, my sexual preference is this, and my sexual preference is that. This is commodity capitalism. I like Slurpees. I like ice cream. I like meat. I like chicken. That's not the way humanity works. You could be the most heterosexual person. You go to prison, your longing for companionship turns you homosexual. Not homosexual meaning you fall in love with a man and you have sex with a man. Men in prison, when they get raped long enough, they come out not sure of their sexuality anymore. Instead of Muslims sitting there and whining and complaining, why don't they study science and produce their alternative narratives that defies colonial paradigms? That's my point. I remember when I was very young, this is embarrassing, but now that I'm annoyed, so I'm going to actually tell the story. My parents got the bright idea, I don't know why. They wanted me to have a proper civilized education. So they went to the great expense of sending me to a school called Gordonston in Scotland. And, this is the school where Prince Charles went. He hated it and dropped out. But this is where like the sons of kings in the Middle East and queens and, but we could only afford for me to go for a summer. So I just spent the summer in Gordonston. So I go to Gordonston. Of course, I hated it. I mean, it's just like, it's a, you know, all boys school, and I, you know, it's like everything's so British, and you go in a yacht, and who cares about a yacht? And the food was horrible. I couldn't understand what the heck they're talking about all the time. But I remember I had a kid with me who was older than me. He was 14 years old. And he was Saudi. I'm not picking on Saudis. That's just a fact. And there was a young kid who was 12 years old who was very good looking. Very white. Had very nice hair. And I would do my salah. I was very like straight and narrow. No girls, no Playboy magazines. As you know, when of course the Arabs go to the Middle East, the first thing they do is like they go nothing. I was very straight and narrow. But I found out that this Saudi kid who was, if you called him homosexual, he would beat you to death, paid that 12-year-old kid 300 pounds to have sex with him. And I knew that this kid, the Saudi kid, prayed. He would pray Jama'ah with me. But, so I was crushed. I was very young, and I was crushed. Like, how could you do that? And he said, I couldn't resist. I said, what do you mean you couldn't resist? That's a boy. He said, you want to tell me, you want to swear on the Quran you weren't aroused by him? Don't you see how pretty he is? And that stayed with me. That man today is married and he has 4 kids. And I met him and I asked him 20 years later if he ever had sex with another man or boy, another male. And he swore to me that he never did. So I asked him why. He said because he was very exciting, very attractive. I said, are you homosexual? He said, no, I'm not. And anyone who says I'm homosexual, I'll beat the heck out of him. But you know what? That was normal in the culture I grew up in. I know a lot. When I was a young kid, when I was a boy, I know a lot of men who were married and very heterosexual who made passes at me. And I knew as a young boy that part of my job was to protect myself. We didn't have these categories. You're homosexual, you're straight, you're this, you're that, you're this. So, and I'm not going to concede that there's anything wrong with that, because that seems much more natural than the crap that I encounter in the West.
Alhamdulillah. Well, the bad news is we're out of time. I didn't really want to end on that, although that was great. Thank you. Alhamdulillah. No one can say that we don't take on controversial topics here.
More. That's why. You know. No one will ever donate the money to buy my time, so I can finish this project. Exactly, because you asked me questions like that. It's your fault.
No, I'm proud. I'm proud that we... Look, I mean, people feel comfortable asking questions like that, and they know that they're going to get the truth. Or at least they're going to get, you know, your unfiltered response, which is extremely valuable, alhamdulillah. So thank you for the question, and thank you for the answer. And I think on that note, alhamdulillah, thank you for being with us, and inshallah we will see you guys on Tuesday. And we are doing Taraweeh. We try to do Taraweeh every night, live streamed on YouTube. Around 10, we shoot for 10:30. Sometimes we get a little bit held up with other things, But if you subscribe to our channel and you have your email on, as soon as we go live, you get a notification that we've gone live, so you'll know that we're on and we're praying. So, inshallah, join us.
Join us for
And
Taraweeh.
yeah, so we'll see you soon. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.